Welcome, friends, to the third installment of a video series on the problem of free will. This one's called Decoding Libertarianism, and I'm going to go ahead and clarify just what the heck libertarianism is all about, or at least I'm going to try to in this video. Now, again, this is part 3 of a series of videos, so if you haven't watched the first two, maybe you should check out the first two before you get going on this one. Essentially, we are today taking on this idea that there is no human free will as a threat posed by the findings in the natural sciences in the, let's say 16th and 17th centuries. Okay, well, libertarianism, sometimes known as metaphysical libertarianism to distinguish it from political libertarianism. This is a view that humans do have free will. Moreover, this kind of free will makes it so that our choices are both not determined and not random. This is extremely important because we have covered a view known as compatibilism, also known as soft determinism, that basically says, well, you know what, as long as your desires and choices and behaviors are in alignment, right, there is a union between them, well, then that counts as free will. It doesn't matter if your desires are determined. Well, the libertarian says it does matter. And it also can't be that like quantum randomness is what leads to your behavior. For our behaviors to truly be free, according to the libertarian, they need to be not determined and not random. And by the way, if that's the case, well, that means that determinism is false. This view that every event is forced on us by prior events in conjunction with the laws of nature, that just isn't true, because not all events are forced upon us. At least some of them are not determined, right? Those are human free choices that are not determined. So that is the view known as libertarianism. And so if you have a maybe an event like this one in this image right here, at least some libertarians would say that that behavior right there, that was chosen. At least some actions are free choices. In other words, they were not determined to happen. Now, maybe it might be that after a little bit of that ginormous beer, the choices aren't so free, but insofar as we have the capacity to reason, we can override our desires and our situational pressures that we're in and our past and et cetera, we can make principled actions. We can behave in ways that we only follow our valued actions. And so because of that, the libertarian says, because we have that power of reason to override other drives, we do have what they call free will, their version of free will. That shows that not all events are either causally necessitated or random. In the very least, our choices are not determined, or at least some of our choices are not determined. Now, this is compatible with the view that, some of your desires are programmed into you genetically for whatever reason. Maybe it's something that all humans have, like or almost all humans have, I guess, the desire for sex or mates or that kind of thing. Or it could also be, a more personal genetic strand that you have, right? Maybe you have a particular, I know there's some people that apparently don't like cilantro, right? So, that's not really something that you chose, right? That's sometimes in your genes. Apparently it tastes like soap to them. So in any case, this libertarianism is compatible with some desires and some likes and all that, some of them being programmed into you by your environment or by your genes or whatever. But the point is that at least some of your actions you can really think about and ratify with your reason. And in those cases, those actions are free, right? So not every action has to be free, but at least some actions are free. And if you believe that, then you're a libertarian. So it might be that there's a whole chain of causal events. Here we are. Event 1 led to event 2, led to event 3. And you can go down this chain. But eventually, says the libertarian, there are some moments in the causal chain, some parts of the causal chain where we actually see human agency, is the word that we're looking for, making one thing happen instead of another. So here we are stuck at event 4, and let's pretend there's 2 logical possibilities here, event 5 or event 6. And it just happens to be the case that it is not determined which one will happen, event 5 or event 6. And so it is in this case a human at event 4 choosing for event 5 to occur. So some libertarians might argue that it just is the best explanation that humans make some choices, right? If there really is no causally determinate force that makes event 5 happen instead of event 6, well, how else are you going to explain this other than some human made it happen, right? So that is one way to understand libertarianism. There are some events that just aren't determined. Humans made them happen. All right, let's look at a fancy label for this. It's called agent causation. Agent causation refers to an event during which an agent, in other words, an individual, causes something to happen that otherwise wouldn't have happened. That is, the agent causes something that was neither causally determined nor a chance occurrence. Right? So if you are a libertarian, you have to believe in agent causation, some kind of agent causation. Well, it's easy enough to explain the view, I think, although some philosophers might argue that even in my explanation of this view, it was incoherent. That is a persistent charge to libertarianism, that it is incoherent. But for more on that, you have to go to the other videos. Okay, we've presented the view. It's sort of easy to present the view. Maybe it's not so easy to defend the view. So different philosophers have expressed either an outright denial that agent causation is possible, right? Those are the hard determinists. Or a more subtle skepticism that agent causation actually obtains in the natural world. In this little section of the video, we're going to look at the second strand, right? This second kind of objection to libertarianism. And this is just a question of whether agent causation actually happens. We understand the idea, maybe, but is that actually a feature of the natural world? So that is what we're going to consider for a little bit. And one example of this kind of a philosopher that argues for sort of a skepticism about causal agency is the philosopher John Doris. John Doris cites various studies from social psychology that he claims should give us pause about believing that there is such a thing as agent causation, or as he calls it, self-directed behaviors. So this gentleman is, I believe, now at Cornell, and he used to run this very interdisciplinary department at Washington University. I think it was called the Philosophy, Psychology, and Neuroscience program. In any case, John Doris uses all kinds of recent experimental evidence to not really refute libertarianism, but to cast a little bit of doubt on its truth. He calls this kind of argument a defeater. Actually, he's not the one that coined the term defeater. That has been around for a while. But a defeater doesn't actually defeat. That's kind of a funny name for it, actually, then. A defeater, what it does is it blocks you from claiming that you know something for sure. So a defeater argument in this case doesn't refute libertarianism. It just kind of makes you wonder if it's actually true. So in particular, social psychologists have been demonstrating that the environment seems to play a greater role in our behavior than do, say, our character traits, our feelings, our desires, and our rationality. So what is going on here? Well, one very good example of this is actually, you can get a feel for it here in this image. This is a stained glass window depicting the Good Samaritan parable. And if you don't know about the Good Samaritan, here is the basic gist. Someone got beat up, and a lot of people passed that person by and not helped. People that should have probably stopped, including some clerics and some religious representatives. But the only person that did stop was a Samaritan, a good Samaritan. And he made sure that the injured person was cared for and left them at an inn, etc., etc. So some psychological experiments, including a very famous one called the Good Samaritan Study, have showed that it looks like external forces, things outside of you, are what make you behave one way or another. So in this experiment in particular, which was done at Princeton Seminary by some psychologists named Darley and Batson, it basically showed that people would literally walk over someone who is in need of help, depending on not their character traits, but whether or not they were in a rush. So in this experiment, there were 3 groups, I believe, and one of them was told, hey, you got to go to this other building and you have to give a talk like right now. Another group was told, hey, you have to go to this other building, but you're basically on time. Don't rush or anything, but head straight over. And a third group was told, you got to go to this building, give a talk, and well, you got plenty of time. Go ahead and take your time, get there when you can. We'll see you over there. What was the talk on? None other than the Good Samaritan parable that I just described. And funnily enough, these students, who were all seminary students, right? They were all going to be getting degrees in theology. They all stopped depending on how much time they had. In other words, if you had a lot of time, you were more likely to stop. If you were told that you got to get to this building now, well, then they wouldn't stop for this person. That shows that, they did all these surveys on the participants in the study first. They were trying to figure out, how religious are you? What is the root of your religious motivation? None of these things seem to matter. The only thing that was predictive of whether or not they would stop is whether or not they were in a rush. That shows that your situational context, that's what decides what you do. That's very weird, and there's a whole century's worth of experiments that basically show that. That's what John Doris argues, at least. Here are some more findings from social psychology. In many instances, it seems that the situation's effect on our mood is what drives us to act in certain ways, such as when we act differently after watching a funny video, treat others worse on hot days, or are less helpful when there's loud noises nearby. That last one is my favorite. Apparently, people were less helpful if there was a lawnmower, blaring nearby. And so social psychologists have done these experiments to see what happens, right? Like, give people an opportunity to do something nice for someone else. But in one situation, the subjects in the experiment, there's no noise. And in the other, there's a really loud lawnmower. And lo and behold, the people when there's a loud lawnmower don't help as much. Similar things happen when you're watching a funny video. You're more likely to, this is actually really weird, but you're more likely to be okay with causing harm to one person as long as there's more positive outcomes in the end. So that's another kind of a strange situation that happens. If you just watch a funny video first, you're more likely to sacrifice someone for the greater good. And there's actually lots of studies about how judges act differently on hot days. So for information on that, you can check out this book called Noise. by several authors. One of them is the Nobel Prize winning Daniel Kahneman, the psychologist. So anyway, lots of studies that show that the situation is what determines, should I say, let's be less, provocative. Let's just say the situation greatly influences your behavior. Okay, well, that's John Dorsey's argument, and it seems to undermine libertarianism. There might be an objection here, and let's see what you think. One objection to Dorsey's empirically informed argument is that some of the studies that motivate this kind of skepticism about causal agency have failed to replicate. And in fact, various fields of social science are going through what some call a replication crisis. This is not too much fun to talk about, but it turns out when some scientists try to replicate, just means duplicate, the findings of others, there was a shockingly low success rate as far as the replication goes. And this goes from psychology to economics to medicine is actually one of the more concerning one. That's the one where you really want it to replicate, right? In any case, this is quite a good objection in the sense that perhaps some of Doris's studies that he used from his work, which goes back at least 20 years at the time of this recording, maybe some of those studies didn't replicate. So some of the edge gets taken off of Doris's argument there. Well, that is a whole, class unto itself. I don't mean a lesson. I mean an entire course on what it is that we learn from the replication crisis in the social sciences. What is the cause of it? What I can say right now is that John Doris, who, again, first gave us his arguments some 20 years ago, he has responded, and I just did want to include that real quick because it is interesting. You want philosophy to maybe be informed by the sciences, but sometimes the sciences, the facts are always changing. That's sort of the nature of science. Some findings are here for a while, and then they get thrown out in favor of newer findings. So this is maybe a good type of philosophy to pursue, but it's also problematic, right? So here's what Doris responds. There is some trouble in psychology, but that doesn't mean we're better off trusting common sense than we are trusting the best available systematic study. Doubtless numbers of scientific findings should be discarded, but if all scientific findings were cast aside, we'd have a lot bigger problems in working out the right account of agency. Maybe here's one way to think about what Doris is saying. Sure, some findings didn't replicate, right? Some studies did not replicate. But you know what? Some of them did. And here are the kinds, if you're a libertarian, you essentially want none of these studies to replicate. But the number wasn't zero, right? It was just lower than expected. So one way to think about this then is there's still something fishy going on, and we perhaps need more research to get to the bottom of this. And clearly we need to make sure that the psychological literature is as strong as possible before we can come to a decision on this. But we don't just go with our gut, right? We don't just by default say, well, that means libertarianism is true. That's basically what John Doris is saying. Okay, well, maybe libertarianism is true. Maybe it's not. I'm okay with calling it a draw, right, for the sake of this video at least. One thing I should note, though, is that, let's just say that we do successfully defend libertarianism. That doesn't really get us home free, right? So even if we could defend libertarian free will successfully, this sort of free will alone doesn't address all of the unnecessary suffering that motivates skepticism about God's existence. There is still, for example, the suffering caused by natural disasters. Remember why we got into this problem in the first place. We were trying to solve the problem of evil. And the argument that we looked at was something like, If God exists, there shouldn't be any unnecessary suffering. But it seems like there is some unnecessary suffering. That must mean God doesn't exist. Well, the free will solution to this problem of evil says that, oh no, unnecessary suffering is caused by human free will. Well, let's just say that we accept libertarianism for the moment. That doesn't account for all the unnecessary suffering. Really, volcanoes, right? There was one that erupted something like 70,000 years ago and almost killed off the human species. That seems like a pretty good example of unnecessary suffering, and volcanoes erupting has nothing to do with human free will. That just is not something that we've caused. So it really does seem that even if we do get libertarian free will defended in some kind of satisfactory manner, it doesn't actually solve all of the problem of evil for us. So where does that leave us? Well, kind of where we started. But don't worry. In the next lesson, we will see someone who will try to rescue free will.